Okay, the reading for this week is the next part in our series on classical Chinese civilization, culture, philosophy, literature. And today we'll be reading a very famous essay by Tao Yuanming, and also a very famous poem by Tao Yuanming. And I'll get to the poem after we do the essay, so let me start with the essay. And the essay is called Peach Blossom Spring. And in Japanese, I should mention here at the outset, there's a word called, Togenkyo, which is sort of often translated as utopia. And the origin of this notion of Togenkyo, I'll put some more information about this word and its sources and its meaning and so forth in the description or in the worksheet for this class, but it originates with this essay by Tao Yuanming. Okay, so whenever you hear Togenkyo, remember that it comes from this essay that I'm about to read by Tao Yuanming called Peach Blossom Spring. Okay, so first some information about Tao Yuanming, born in 376, died in 427. So this is the period of the 6 dynasties. And as always, I'll put the chronology of Chinese dynasties in the description below. The 6 dynasties is the period of instability and warfare and so forth that follows the fall of the Han. Right, so the 6 dynasties has several phases within it, several dynasties within it, and Tao Yuanming lived during the Qing dynasty, which was the second of the 6 dynasties, and the Qing dynasty is 265 to 420. Okay, and the 6 dynasties in all begins in 220 after the fall of the Han, and ends in 589. So this is the second dynasty of the 6 dynasties, and this is the period of upheaval that Tao Yuanming lived through. Okay, so he's a man of the southern part of China during the time of the Eastern Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty is further divided into 2 sections. He lived mostly during the Eastern Qing Dynasty, 317 to 420, so the latter part of the Qing Dynasty. And its successor state, the Liu Song Dynasty, or the Liu Dynasty it's often called, which succeeded the Qing Dynasty. So this is the period he lived in, and this is a period in which China was divided between northern and southern dynasties. The years between the final collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220 and the Sui Dynasty's reunification of the north and south in 589, so over 360 years approximately, 369 years, were characterized by warfare and instability. So he lived right in the middle of this period of warfare and instability. The rulers and elite of the south were tortured by the loss of the north to various non-Chinese, mostly Turkic, rulers. In both north and south, one ruling house succeeded another. It was in this context of instability that Tao Yuanming, an official, scholar, and poet, wrote his famous essay, Peach Blossom Spring, okay, about this kind of world that he stumbles across, and sort of utopian world that exists outside of time, and he goes back to find it at a later date and can't find it, so it kind of disappears. And I'll read it, the entire essay now. It's very short, just 2 pages. And the translation here comes from Anthology of Chinese Literature, Volume 1, by Cyril Birch. And it's a bit outdated, so the romanization for the Chinese words is in the old Wade's, Giles style, rather than the more common pinyin that you see today. Okay. And here's the essay, Peach Blossom Spring by Tao Yuanming. During the reign of Taiyuan of the Qing Dynasty, it says here, but change that, cross that out, and write in Jin, J-I-N Dynasty, which is the more modern, more contemporary way to romanize it. So during the reign period, Taiyuan of the Jin Dynasty, there lived in Wuling a certain fisherman. Okay, so this is the story of the fisherman who discovers this utopian world. One day, as he followed the course of the stream, he became unconscious of the distance he had traveled. All at once, he came upon a grove of blossoming peach trees, which lined either bank for hundreds of paces. No tree of any other kind stood amongst them, but there were fragrant flowers, delicate and lovely to the eye, and the air was filled with drifting peach bloom. The fisherman, marveling, passed on to discover where the grove would end. It ended at a spring, and then there came a hill. In the side of the hill was a small opening which seemed to promise a gleam of light. The fisherman left his boat and entered the opening. It was almost too cramped at first to afford him passage, but when he had taken a few dozen steps, he emerged into the open light of day. He faced a spread of level land. Imposing buildings stood among rich fields and pleasant ponds, all set with mulberry and willow. Linking paths led everywhere, and the fowls and dogs of one farm could be heard from the next. People were coming and going and working in the fields. Both the men and the women dressed in exactly the same manner as people outside. White-haired elders and tufted children alike were cheerful and contented. Some, noticing the fisherman, started in great surprise and asked him where he had come from. He told them his story. They then invited him to their home, where they set out wine and killed chickens for a feast. When news of his coming spread through the village, everyone came in to question him. For their part, they told how their forefathers, fleeing from the troubles of the age of Qing Dynasty, had come with their wives and neighbors to this isolated place, never to leave it. So they're seeking refuge from the warfare of the Qing Dynasty, the age of Qing, never to leave it. From that time on, they had been cut off from the outside world. They asked what age was this. They had never even heard of the Han Dynasty, let alone its successors, the Wei and the Qing. The Wei is the first of the 6 dynasties, I think. The fishermen answered each of their questions in full, and they sighed and wondered at what he had to tell. The rest all invited him to their homes in turn, and in each house food and wine were set before him. It was only after a stay of several days that he took his leave. "Do not speak of us to the people outside," they said. But when he had regained his boat and was tracing his original route, he marked it at point after point, and on reaching the prefecture he sought audience of the prefect and told him of all these things. The prefect immediately dispatched officers to go back with the fisherman. He hunted for the marks he had made, but grew confused and never found the way again. The learned and virtuous hermit Liu heard the story and went off elated to find the place, but he had no success and died at length of a sickness. Since that time there have been no further seekers of the ford. Okay, and that was translated by Cyril Birch. And here are 4 study questions that we can discuss in class. Question number 1. What does the essay reveal about the author's state of mind? Okay, the author, state of mind. What is the author's state of mind, and why is he writing the story? So it obviously reflects the fact that he's living in these very, very troubled times, and is kind of longing for a utopian world that is free from the horrors of war and the privations of war and so forth. But we'll discuss more about that in class. Question number 2. Are there any parallels to this essay in other cultures? Okay, so we can think about other literary traditions that seek these sort of similar utopian visions in times of strife and war. Question number 3. Under what circumstances would Chinese in the centuries after Tao Yuanming's time refer to this essay in their writing? And we could add to that Japanese as well. So under what circumstances would Chinese and Japanese in the centuries after, because this story is very central to very influential in Japan as well, and we'll talk about its influence in Japanese classical literature, medieval literature, and even in the present. You see Togenkyo, the word at least, appear very often in modern Japanese literature as well. Question number 4. Consider the long term of Chinese history, so refer to the Dynasties chronology that I have in your worksheet and in the description to this video. So considering this long term of Chinese history, in what historical periods do you think men would be most likely to identify with the author and refer to this piece of writing in their prose or poetry? So do writers and intellectuals recall this story in times of great peace and happiness, or in times of troubles? And we'll discuss this in class. All right, that's the end of this essay. Now I will read his poem. Returning to the fields. Qi Yuan Dian Jiu I forget the Chinese pronunciation of these some of these characters, but in Japanese we say Kien Deng Kyo by Tao Yuanming. And keep in mind that the form of this poem is the Wu Yang Gu Shi, or the pentasyllabic. Wu Yang is 5 syllables, right? 5 kanji, 5 words, pentasyllabic. And Gu Shi is old style poems. So this form is the Wu Yang Gu Shi, or pentasyllabic old style poems. And if you need to review the various major forms of Chinese poetry, go back and watch my video on it, and I'll put a link to that video in the series of videos on Tang poetry, in which I discuss the major forms of Tang poetry in the first 20 minutes or so of that video. You can watch that and review it there. Alright, so this is a Wu Yang Gu Shi. So each line has 5 Chinese characters. Okay. And the translation here is by Arthur Whaley. I'll put information to his translation in the description so you can purchase the book that includes it, and we'll discuss it. And I have the original Chinese below that, and then a Japanese, both the kakikudashi reading of the kanji of the Chinese poem, so it's sort of literal rendering in Japanese, and then a more vernacular contemporary gendayaku in Japanese of the poem as well. And I'll read the gendayaku after I read the English translation here. Alright, Returning to the Fields by Tao Yuanming. When I was young, I was out of tune with the herd. My only love was for the hills and mountains. Unwitting, I fell into the web of the world's dust. Underline dust. Dust, of course, is a Buddhist image, so it has all the connotations of the vulgar things of this fallen world, is sort of the connotation, the associations that usually come with the Buddhist image of, or symbol of, dust. Unwitting, I fell into the web of the world's dust, and was not free until my 30th year. The migrant bird longs for the old wood. The fish in the tank thinks of its native pool. I had rescued from wilderness a patch of the southern moor, and still rustic, I returned to field and garden. So field and garden is this word deng-eng, or en-deng, as it is, appears in the title of this poem. And this became a genre of poetry, a field and garden poetry. My ground covers no more than 10 acres. So 10 acres is pretty large, actually. And my thatched cottage has 8 or 9 rooms. Okay, so he's a hermit living in the woods, but he still has a huge lot, and his thatched cottage is rather big. And I think this Kamono Chome in his Hojoki, or the 10-foot hut, remember in that work that we discussed and we read already in this class, he lives in 2 huts in the course of his narrative. The first hut is large, and I think the first hut more closely resembles this hut that Tao Yuanming lives in, and then he moves to an even smaller hut later on in that work. Okay. Alright, there's too much commentary here. Let me read it again without any commentary. Okay. Arthur Whaley's translation of Returning to the Fields by Tao Yuanming. When I was young, I was out of tune with the herd. My only love was for the hills and mountains. Unwitting, I fell into the web of the world's dust, and was not free until my 30th year. The migrant bird longs for the old wood. The fish in the tank thinks of its native pool. I had rescued from wilderness a patch of the southern moor, and still rustic, I returned to field and garden. My ground covers no more than 10 acres. My thatched cottage has 8 or 9 rooms. Elms and willows cluster by the eaves. Peach trees and plum trees grow before the hall. Hazy, hazy the distant hamlets of men. Steady the smoke of the half-deserted village. A dog barks somewhere in the deep lanes. A cock crows at the top of the mulberry tree. At gate and courtyard, no murmur of the world's dust. In the empty rooms, leisure and deep stillness. Long I lived, checked by the bars of a cage. Now I have turned again to nature and freedom. Translated by Arthur Whaley. And freedom, it's kind of implied in the original, zerang, but the last line of the Chinese just says zerang, nature, right? It doesn't say freedom. but the association is there. So I think Whaley's adding of the word freedom is justified in this case. All right, now I'll read the Gendayaku, the Japanese version of this poem, and we'll discuss. We'll do a comparison of the original, the Japanese version, and the English translation in detail in class. All right. Hopefully I'll be able to pronounce all these words. I'm reading this raw. I haven't prepared it all, so forgive me if I mispronounce anything. はい、日本語の現代訳。若い頃から私は世渡りが下手だった。もともと田舎ののんびりした空気を愛してたのだ。どこで間違ったのか上京して塵にまみれた網のような俗世間に入り込み、以来30年もの月日が流れてしまった。渡り鳥は以前いた林を思い、池の魚は昔住んでた淵を慕うものだ。私も故郷の南の西にの淵の際にある荒地を解剖しよう。世渡り下手のこの性格はそのままでいいじゃないか。故郷の田園に帰るのだ。託児は10歩ちょっと。住居は8、9室ある。二でや柳が後ろのひさしを覆い、桃や、梨が門の前に連なっている。遠くの村はおぼろにかすみ、里で飯を炊く煙が絶え間なく立ち上っている。犬は奥まった路地で鳴き、鳥は桑の木の頂で鳴いている。我が家の庭には鹿一つなく、空いてる部屋も多く、空間には余地がある。長い間、過去の小鳥の生活を続けてきたが、ようやくまた自然に帰ることができた。Okay, we'll go over all this stuff later in class, and that is all for now. I will see you then. Goodbye.